The morning Micah Turner sold his last bundle of beaver pelts, he did not know that the transaction would change the entire course of his life. But the worn letter folded inside his breast pocket had been pressing against his heart for 3 weeks, and he had already made up his mind before he even counted the coins the trader pressed into his calloused palm. The year was 1874, and the Rocky Mountains of Colorado Territory were just beginning to lose their grip on men like Micah. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled behind his ears and a jaw that had not met a razor in a fortnight. His eyes were the deep gray of storm clouds gathering over a mountain pass, and they carried within them the particular stillness of a man who had spent the better part of a decade living entirely alone, speaking more to pine trees and rushing creeks than to other human beings. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches, and he moved with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had learned that the wilderness punished carelessness with death. He had come down from his cabin above the timberline 3 weeks earlier with the season's last haul, fully intending to sell his furs, restock his winter provisions, and return to his solitary life before the first heavy snow sealed the mountain passes. That had been the plan. It was a good, sensible plan, the kind that a practical man made and kept. Then he had stopped at the general store in the small railroad town of Harwick, Colorado, and old Ben Polly, who ran the post, had handed him a letter addressed in a careful, even hand, the ink a deep blue-black against cream paper. Micah had stared at it for a long moment because nobody sent him letters. His mother had died when he was 19. His father had followed 2 years later. He had no siblings, no cousins he kept in contact with, and the one friend he might have called close, a trapper named Orrin Dalloway, had gone south to New Mexico some years back, and neither of them were the writing sort. The letter had been forwarded from the territorial newspaper office in Denver, where, some 6 months prior, and in a moment of profound and inexplicable loneliness, Micah had submitted a small advertisement to the correspondence column. He had sat with a pencil stub for the better part of an evening composing it, scratched it out twice, and finally written something so plain it embarrassed him even as he sent it off. He had written that he was a man of 30 years, sound of body and honest in his dealings, who lived in the Colorado mountains and was not opposed to corresponding with a woman of good character who might find interest in the frontier life. He had included the newspaper office as his address, assuming nothing would come of it and feeling rather foolish for the attempt. Something had come of it. The letter was from Adelaide Townsend of Abilene, Kansas, and from the very first line she had disarmed him completely. She wrote, and he had memorized the words by now the way a man memorizes scripture. "I am responding to your advertisement, Mr. Turner, not because I lack other options, but because yours was the only one that did not attempt to sell me on the idea of myself as a useful commodity. You said you were not opposed to correspondence. I find that I am not opposed to it either, and I think honesty between strangers is rather a better beginning than flattery between fools." He had read that opening 3 times standing in the middle of Ben Polly's store, and something in his chest had shifted, the way ice shifts on a river in early March, creaking and groaning toward an inevitable breaking open. Adelaide Townsend was 26 years old, she told him. She had been born in Ohio, come west with her family to Kansas when she was 12, and had been teaching school in Abilene for the past 4 years. Her father had died the previous spring, leaving her and her younger sister Clara with the small house he had owned and a modest but sufficient inheritance. She wrote with characteristic directness, not desperate. She was curious. The advertisement had made her curious about the kind of man who would phrase things as Micah had, and curiosity was something she had always considered her finest quality and occasionally her most inconvenient one. He had written back. Not immediately, because he had carried the letter up the mountain and read it 4 more times and paced the length of his cabin and stepped outside to watch the stars wheel overhead and argued with himself about the wisdom of engaging with something he could not fully understand. Then he had written back, and the writing had come easier than he expected. He told her about the mountains. He told her about the way the light looked in October when it slanted through the aspen groves and turned everything the color of hammered gold. He told her about the silence that was not really silence at all, but a layered, living thing full of wind and water, and the movements of animals. He told her that he had been a trapper since the age of 22, and that the life suited him in most respects, though he acknowledged that it was a solitary one, and that he had lately begun to wonder if a man could be fully content with beauty alone for company. He had not told her how much that admission had cost him. He was not a man who admitted to wanting things. She had written back within a month, and her second letter was longer than the first and funnier and sharper, and full of small observations about the world that made him laugh out loud alone in his cabin, which startled him considerably, because he had almost forgotten that laughter was something his body knew how to do. She described Abilene as a town trying desperately to be respectable now that the great cattle drives were diminishing, and the rougher element was moving on with them. She described her students with a warmth that was entirely unsentimental, clear-eyed about their difficulties and their gifts alike. She described a particular sunset she had watched from her front porch that had turned the Kansas sky 17 different shades of orange and pink, and she said she had wished, quite specifically and perhaps foolishly, that she had someone beside her to witness it. That sentence undid something in Micah Turner that had been knotted tight for years. They had corresponded for 5 months. The letters were the rhythm of his winter, better than any fire he had built, warmer than any blanket he owned. He began to know her voice in the words, the way her thoughts moved, quick and lateral and generous. He learned that she had read more books than most men he knew had held in their hands. He learned that she had a strong opinion about the proper way to make cornbread, and a stronger one about the iniquity of certain territorial land policies that were displacing farming families who had broken their backs to build something. He learned that she had a laugh she described as unfortunate and loud, and that she was resigned to it. He learned that she was afraid of very little but had a deep and abiding dislike of dishonesty, which she had encountered enough of in her 26 years to have developed a refined nose for it. He learned that she made him want to be a better man, which was not something he had expected a collection of letters to accomplish. And then, 3 weeks ago, she had written a letter that was different from the others. It was quieter. There was something in the phrasing, a restraint that was not her natural register, and between the careful lines, he read a woman who was waiting for something and was too proud to ask for it outright. She wrote that spring was coming early to Kansas, and that the prairie would be green soon, and that she found she was thinking more than usual about what the mountains must look like when the snow began to melt. She wrote that she hoped his winter had been kind to him. She wrote that she had told Clara about their correspondence and that Clara had said, "Well, why don't you just invite him to come and meet you, Adelaide, because you are quite obviously hoping he will." She had written, "My sister is occasionally very perceptive. I find I have no particular response to her observation. I merely pass it along as a curiosity." Micah Turner had read that letter twice, put it down, picked it up again, walked outside and stood in the snow for a long time looking at the mountains, and then walked back inside and begun calculating what his season's furs would bring. Now he stood at the fur trader's table in Harwick with $37.60 in his hand, which was a fair price for what he had brought down, and he looked across the dusty street at the railroad office with its painted sign, and the schedule posted in the window, and he felt the letter against his heart, and he thought about a woman in Kansas who had passed along her sister's perceptive observation and called it a curiosity. He crossed the street. The man behind the railroad office counter was named Gus Farrow, a round-bellied fellow in sleeve garters who looked faintly startled when Micah ducked through the door, the way people often looked at Micah when he came in from the mountains, as though he was a piece of the wilderness that had temporarily taken the shape of a man. "What can I do for you?" Pharaoh asked. "Train to Abilene," Micah said. "What does it cost?" Pharaoh quoted him a price. It was most of what he had. He would have nothing left for winter provisions, which meant he could not go back to the mountain until he had earned more, which meant the cabin would sit empty through spring and maybe into summer, which meant the life he had built with his own hands over 8 years of careful, deliberate solitude would be interrupted in a way he could not entirely predict. He put the money on the counter. "Round trip?" Pharaoh asked. Micah thought about that for a moment. He thought about the 17 shades of orange and pink. He thought about the sentence that had undone the knot in his chest. "One way," he said. He spent the 2 days before the train departed doing the things a man does when he is rearranging his life. He wrote a letter to Adelaide Townsend, explaining that he was coming and giving her the approximate date of his arrival, then realized with a lurch of pure anxiety that the letter would almost certainly not reach her before he did, given the pace of the mail and the distance involved. He sent it anyway, because it seemed important not to simply appear on her doorstep without warning like something the prairie had deposited there. He bought himself a clean shirt from the dry goods store, which cost him the last of his small change. He found a barber and suffered through a shave that left his jaw feeling oddly exposed and raw. He told Ben Polly where he was going, because Ben Polly was the closest thing he had to a friend in Harwick, and it seemed right. Ben, who was 70 years old and had seen a great many things, looked at Micah for a long moment and then said, "Is she worth it?" Micah thought about it seriously the way he thought about most things. "I think she might be," he said. "I think she might be the kind of worth it that a man only gets one chance at." Ben nodded. "Then go," he said, "and don't be a fool about it when you get there." The train left Harwick on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March, 1874, heading east through the foothills and then out onto the broad, flat, relentless expanse of the Great Plains. Micah sat in a passenger car that smelled of coal smoke and other people's meals, and watched the mountains diminish behind him through the window with a feeling he could not quite name, part grief and part exhilaration, the way a man feels when he trades one true thing for the possibility of another. The journey took the better part of 2 days with the connections in Pueblo, and then north to the Kansas line. He slept in his seat and ate the biscuits he had brought wrapped in cloth and watched the land change from the high country he knew into something enormous and uncontained, the sky bigger than he had ever seen it, the horizon impossibly far. He had known Kansas was flat, but knowing and experiencing were different things, and after years in the mountains the openness of it made something in him feel slightly off balance, the way a man feels on a ship the first time he tries to stand on moving water. He arrived in Abilene on a Thursday afternoon in late March, stepping off the train onto the platform into a wind that was warm and smelled of fresh earth, and the particular green smell of new grass, and something else he could not identify, but which he thought might simply be spring on the plains, which was apparently a different season from spring in the mountains. He stood on the platform with his bedroll on his shoulder and his rifle case in his hand, and his clean shirt already rumpled from 2 days of travel, and he felt quite suddenly and powerfully ridiculous. He did not know where Adelaide Townsend lived. He had her address, which she had included in her 3rd letter, but he had a general address for a town he had never visited and no certain knowledge of its layout. He had not thought this particular detail through as thoroughly as he might have liked. Abilene in 1874 was a town in the middle of reinventing itself. The great years of the Texas cattle drives, when the Kishom Trail had deposited thousands of longhorns and their accompanying drovers at the Abilene stockyards, were winding down as new railheads opened further south. The wildest years were behind it. But the town retained a vitality, a kind of restless energy, with solid brick buildings going up alongside older wooden ones, churches and schools and decent establishments doing their earnest best to establish Abilene as a place of respectability and consequence. It was not small. A man could get lost in it without someone to ask directions of. Micah asked a man on the platform if he knew the location of the school, on the theory that a schoolteacher would be known in relation to her school. And the man, who was a porter with a cheerful and voluble nature, gave him directions to the schoolhouse on Elm Street and told him for good measure that school would just be letting out about now if he was looking to speak to one of the teachers, since it was late afternoon. Micah thanked him and walked. He heard the school before he saw it, the bright sound of children released into freedom, their voices rising and mixing and scattering in every direction. He turned the corner onto Elm Street, and there it was, a neat white building with a bell tower, and children flowing out of the front door like water freed from a dam, running and calling to one another in the particular joyful chaos that is universal to the end of a school day in any era. He stopped at the gate of the low wooden fence that bordered the schoolyard and watched, and then he saw her. He knew it was her the way he knew certain things in the wilderness, without being able to fully explain the mechanism of knowing, a recognition that operated below the level of conscious thought. She stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse watching her students depart, a woman of medium height with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical hat, wearing a gray dress with a small white collar. She was speaking to a boy of about 10 who had apparently lingered to ask something, and her head was tilted slightly as she listened to him. And even from 30 yards away, Micah could see the quality of her attention, the way she gave it fully and without reservation. She was not what the word beautiful typically conjured in the dime novels and illustrated papers of the era, not decorative or ornamental in the fashion that those publications celebrated. She was something better. She was vivid. She had a face that moved when she was thinking, quick and expressive, and even across the distance he could see the moment she answered the boy's question and the answer satisfied him, because she smiled and the smile changed her whole face the way the sun changes a landscape it emerges into after clouds. The boy ran off. The schoolyard was emptying. Adelaide Townsend looked up and out across the street with the particular unseeing gaze of someone whose thoughts are still occupied with the immediate past, and then her eyes moved and found the tall, unfamiliar man standing at her gate with a bedroll on his shoulder and a rifle case in his hand and a clean shirt that had been on the train for 2 days. He watched her see him. He watched the moment of simple observation become something else as she looked at him with the same quality of attention she had given the boy, and he did not breathe. And then he saw her lips move, though he was too far away to hear the words, and he was quite sure she had said his name. She came down the 3 steps of the schoolhouse porch and walked toward him, not hurrying but not dawdling either, with the direct and purposeful walk of a woman who had made a decision and was acting on it. And he opened the gate and stepped through it, and they stood looking at each other for a moment at a distance of perhaps 6 feet, which was close enough to see the color of her eyes, which were green, a particular warm green like new leaves in filtered light, and the small spray of freckles across her nose. And the fact that her hands, clasped in front of her, were gripping each other with a tension that suggested she was not quite as composed as her walk had indicated. "Mr. Turner," she said. Her voice was lower than he had imagined it, warm and a little rough at the edges, the voice of someone who talked for a living and meant what they said. "Miss Townsend," he said, and his own voice came out quieter than intended, which happened to him sometimes when he felt things strongly. They looked at each other for another moment. "You came," she said. "You mentioned the prairie turning green," he said, which was not quite the explanation he had intended but which was, he felt, accurate. Something moved in her face, quick as a bird taking flight, and then she said, "My letter could not possibly have reached you in time." "No," he agreed. "So you decided before I wrote it?" "Yes." She looked at him with those green eyes for another long moment, and he could see her thinking, that quick lateral movement of her mind that he had come to know through 5 months of letters, and then she said, "You had better come for supper then." Clara is making pot roast and she makes it well, and you look like you have not had a proper meal in some time." "Probably not," he admitted. She turned and began walking, and he fell into step beside her, and the March wind moved through the elm trees along the street and carried the smell of green things growing, and he thought that he had traded his furs for a train ticket and come a very long way on the strength of letters alone, and that so far, in these first few minutes, everything he had come for was exactly what the letters had promised. The house was on a quiet street 3 blocks from the school, a modest white clapboard with a front porch on which 2 rocking chairs sat angled toward each other in a way that suggested they were frequently used for conversation. The yard had a kitchen garden just showing the first stubble of early plantings, and there was a well-maintained fence that Micah's practiced eye noted had been recently repaired, the posts straight and the wire tight. Clara Townsend was 22 years old and looked like her sister, but more immediately, openly expressive, the kind of young woman whose every thought moved directly to her face without the intermediate step of consideration. She opened the front door before they reached the porch, which meant she had been watching from the window, and her expression when she saw Micah was one of frank and delighted appraisal that she made no effort to conceal. "You are very tall," she said to Micah by way of greeting. Then to Adelaide, "He is very tall, Adelaide." "Yes, Clara, I can see that," Adelaide said, with the patient tone of someone who had been managing their younger sister's exuberance for 22 years and had mostly made peace with it. "I am Clara Townsend," Clara said to Micah, extending her hand in a forthright way that pleased him. "I am the one who told Adelaide she should invite you." "I know," Micah said, and he shook her hand. "I am grateful to you." Clara looked at her sister with an expression of great satisfaction, and Adelaide gave her the look that older sisters have given younger ones since the beginning of time, and led Micah inside. The house was orderly and lived in, with books everywhere, on shelves and on tables, and on chairs in the manner of people who read constantly and returned books to their shelves only intermittently. There was a braided rug in the main room and curtains that had probably been white, and were now a kind of cream from many washings, and a writing desk near the window, with a stack of papers that Micah recognized immediately as student compositions, because Adelaide had described the particular experience of marking them in no fewer than 3 letters. There were 2 framed photographs on the mantelpiece, a severe-looking man and woman who must be her parents, and a small painting of what might have been an Ohio landscape, a gentler green and flatter topography than anything Micah knew. He felt, standing in that room, the accumulated reality of the woman he had been corresponding with. Everything he had built from her words had been right, as far as he could tell, and that rightness was both deeply satisfying and slightly overwhelming. Supper was pot roast as promised, with root vegetables and bread that Clara had baked, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked. The conversation was not awkward in the way that first meetings often are, because they were not truly strangers. They had the texture of 5 months of honest correspondence between them, and it was more like meeting in person someone you have known for a long time at a distance, the translation of a known voice into a physical presence. Micah found himself talking more than he had talked in a very long time, because Adelaide asked questions the way she had written letters, with genuine interest and without performance, and questions like that from a person like her were difficult to be silent against. He told them about the journey, about the mountains diminishing behind the train, about the shock of the plains opening up. Clara, who had grown up on those plains, was delighted by the idea that anyone could find them disorienting, and described them with a fierce and personal pride that made both Micah and Adelaide laugh. He told them more about his life in the mountains, the cabin he had built, the particular rhythms of trapping and the seasons, the animals he saw and the ones he never saw but knew were there from their signs. He was careful not to make it sound romantic in the way the dime novels made the frontier sound, because Adelaide had expressed in one of her letters a healthy suspicion of romanticized accounts of hardship, noting that people who called other people's suffering picturesque generally were not the ones doing the suffering. After supper, Clara did the washing up with a pointed and transparent efficiency designed to give them time alone, and Adelaide and Micah took their coffee cups and went out to the front porch and sat in those two rocking chairs angled toward each other. And the evening came down over Abilene in layers of blue and indigo, and the first stars appeared, and a mockingbird in the elm tree at the fence went through its complete repertoire twice. "I was not expecting you yet," Adelaide said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation with something underneath it that was trying to be careful. "I know," he said. "My letter is probably still in Colorado somewhere. What does your letter say?" He thought about it, that I was coming and that I thought I should tell you first, but that I had already decided to come before I wrote it. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening street. "Why," she said finally, "that is, I know the general reason. I understand what the correspondence has been. I simply mean, specifically, what was it that decided you?" He turned his coffee cup in his big hands, looking at it. "You said your sister told you to invite me," he said. "And you said you had no particular response to that. And then you said you were passing it along as a curiosity." "Yes." "Adelaide," he said, and her name in his voice was a careful, serious thing, the way he said everything when it mattered. "A woman who has no particular response does not pass the observation along in a letter to the man in question. She simply doesn't mention it." The silence that followed was the kind that has a great deal of content in it. He could hear her breathing. He could hear the mockingbird and a dog somewhere down the street, and the faint sound of music from an establishment on the far side of town. "That is a fair point," she said at last, and her voice had changed, dropped some of its careful layering, become something more direct and vulnerable and real. "I am told I am sometimes too clever by half." "Not too clever," he said, "just cleverer than you realize other people might be." She turned and looked at him then, and in the lamplight from the window her eyes were dark and her face was open in a way he did not think she opened it easily, and she said, "You are not at all what I expected, Micah Turner, and I had already formed quite a detailed picture of you." "Was I better or worse than the picture?" "Different," she said. "Larger, quieter, and rather more perceptive than I had accounted for, which is saying something, because I accounted for quite a lot of perception." He smiled, and she watched him do it with an expression that was something between surprise and pleasure, as though smiling was not something she had fully anticipated his face doing. And he thought that he had been alone in the mountains for a long time, and that loneliness had been acceptable so long as he did not acknowledge it too directly, but that acknowledging it now felt less like defeat and more like finally putting down a very heavy thing he had been carrying unnecessarily. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a practical question, the way she framed everything, straight to the heart of the matter without dressing it in excess language. "I don't know exactly," he said, which was true. "I have no plan beyond the fact of being here." "You have no provisions," she said. "You have no arrangements for lodging. You have given up your income for this season, and you have no place to be in Kansas." "That is accurate," he said. "That was either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," he said. "Things that are one tend to be the other." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she said, quietly, "There is a boarding house on Maple Street run by a woman named Mrs. Holt, who is respectable and not excessively expensive. I will give you directions in the morning. And there is work at the livery and at the mill for a man who does not mind hard work, and you clearly do not." "No," he agreed. "And," she said and paused, and he could see her being brave in the way that she was brave, directly and without fanfare, "if you are amenable to it, I would like to continue what the letters have been. Only in person." "That is all I came for," he said. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Micah Turner had experienced in his adult life, which had been, up to this point, built on solitude and self-sufficiency, and the long, slow satisfactions of a life lived at one remove from most of humanity. He took a room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house, which was clean and modest, and found work at the livery stable where a man named Reuben Shaw ran the operation with a skeleton crew, and was glad of an extra pair of experienced hands, particularly one that knew horses the way Micah knew them, which was intimately and without fear. Reuben Shaw was a black man of about 50, solid and precise in everything he did, with the careful dignity of someone who had navigated a great deal of injustice and come through it with his self-respect fully intact. He had come to Kansas in the early 1860s, one of many black Americans who had made the journey west for a chance at something that resembled fairness, and he had built his livery business from nothing over 10 years of unrelenting work. He was one of the more respected men in Abilene's business community, though Micah also noticed the particular kind of double accounting that went on, the way certain men of the town spoke to Reuben in a tone of elaborate courtesy that was somehow more demeaning than frank rudeness, a tone that suggested the respect was conditional and could be withdrawn at the convenience of those offering it. Micah, who had lived too long alone to have much patience for the complicated social performances of settled civilization, spoke to Reuben the way he spoke to anyone he thought worth speaking to, which was directly and with respect. And Reuben, who had an extremely well-developed ability to read men, assessed this within the first few days and decided that Micah Turner was the genuine article, and they settled into an easy working relationship that was, by the end of the first month, something that deserved the word friendship. Adelaide and Micah fell into a routine that was the physical translation of what their letters had been. She was teaching through the week, and he was working at the livery, and in the evenings he would come to the house on Elm Street and they would sit on the porch or in the parlor and talk the way people talk when they have a great deal of ground to cover and find the covering of it entirely pleasurable. Sometimes Clara joined them, and sometimes she tactfully did not, and her absences were managed with a transparency that would have been endearing in a less spirited person and was entirely endearing in her. He watched Adelaide teach one afternoon when she invited him to observe, and it was one of the more illuminating experiences of his life. She was different in front of her students, not different in character but different in scale, the same qualities magnified and deployed with skill, her attention precise and her demands genuine and her pleasure in their understanding visible and real. She taught them arithmetic and letters and geography and history, and he sat in the back of the room and watched her move among the desks and felt something large and slow moving in his chest, something that was taking the shape of a certainty. On a Saturday in late April, when the prairie had done exactly what she had described and turned green in every direction, she packed a basket, and they walked out of town along a creek that wound through a stand of cottonwoods, and they sat in the dappled shade and ate the bread and cheese and dried apple she had brought. And the creek went over its stones in the particular musical way that all creeks go over stones, which was one of the sounds Micah associated most profoundly with peace. And Adelaide took off her hat and let the breeze move her hair and tilted her face up to the light with her eyes closed for a moment. And he watched her do that and thought he would like to watch her do exactly that kind of thing for a very long time. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," she said with her eyes still closed. He considered the request with the seriousness it deserved. "When I built my cabin," he said, "the winter I was 22, the first winter on my own, I got sick. Nothing serious in the end, a fever that broke after a week. But I was delirious for 2 days, and when I came back to myself I was more frightened than I have been before or since. Not of death. Of the fact that no one would have known, that I could have died in that cabin and the world would have continued for weeks before anyone thought to look." She opened her eyes. She was looking at him with that full attention quality. "Is that why you put the advertisement in the paper?" He thought about it. "Partly," he said. "I think I had gotten to a point where I could see the shape of my life continuing as it was, and it seemed very clear and very complete, and I could not decide whether that was enough or whether I had simply gotten so accustomed to doing without that I had stopped noticing I was doing without." "And now?" she asked. "Now I can tell the difference," he said. She put her hat back on and looked out at the creek, and he could see her being careful with the response, turning it over, and then she said, "I was engaged once, before my father died, to a man named Gerald Whitmore, who was a banker's clerk and very correct in everything, and whom I convinced myself I loved because he was reliable and because I was 23 and because people kept asking when Adelaide was going to settle down." She paused. He did not like that I had opinions. He thought opinions in a wife were something he could address over time. He was wrong about that, but it was not a comfortable thing for either of us to discover. "What happened?" Micah asked. "I called it off," she said. He was not very surprised. His mother was not surprised at all, which told me a great deal about what she had told her son he was taking on. She smiled, a small, private smile. "She was quite right, but I thought it very presumptuous of her to know it before I did." He laughed, the sudden real laugh that she had been pulling out of him with regularity and that still seemed to startle him each time, as though laughter were a reflex he kept forgetting he possessed. "Adelaide," he said, and she turned and looked at him with those green eyes, "I am not Gerald Whitmore." "No," she agreed. "You are not remotely Gerald Whitmore." Which is one of the things I find most encouraging about this situation. Spring deepened. The cottonwoods along the creek came fully into leaf. The prairie stretched out in every direction under a sky that was, as Adelaide had promised, enormous, and Micah found himself making a kind of peace with the flatness of it, finding its own kind of beauty, which was different from the mountain beauty he knew, but was genuine and not inferior, merely horizontal where the other was vertical. He spent a Sunday morning helping Reuben repair the fence along the corral, and Reuben, who had been watching Micah and Adelaide with the keen interest of a man who understood human nature well, said, without preamble, "You going to ask that woman to marry you?" Micah drove a nail into a post with 2 clean strokes and said, "I'm considering it." "A fine woman," Reuben said. "Smart, serious-minded, not the kind that takes to being made a fool of." "I know," Micah said. "You're a serious-minded man yourself," Reuben said, "which is most of what she needs." He drove his own nail. "A woman like that needs a man who can keep up with her thinking. Most men can't. Bothers them that they can't, so they try to slow her down instead." He looked at Micah. "You keep up." "I try," Micah said. "You do more than try," Reuben said. "I've seen you two talk. You're the first man I've seen look like he's having the time of his life just listening to what she says." That observation stayed with Micah for the rest of the day. In the evening he went to the house on Elm Street, and Clara opened the door and looked at his face and said, with the unerring instinct of a younger sister, "Adelaide is in the garden." And there was something in how she said it that implied she knew exactly what was in his expression and thought it was about time. The garden was behind the house, and Adelaide was kneeling beside a row of bean plants, tying up the ones that needed support with lengths of twine, and she had dirt on her hands, and her hat was on the ground beside her knee, and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to her hair. She heard him come through the gate and looked up and said, "Hand me that piece of twine," and he did, and knelt beside her and helped her finish the row. When the last plant was tied, they sat back on their heels and looked at the garden, and the light changed again the way it did at that hour, going golden and slow. "I have been thinking," he said. "A dangerous activity," she said, but gently. "I know what I want," he said. "I have known it for some time. Since probably the 4th letter, if I am being honest with myself, which I am trying to be." She was very still beside him. "I want to stay," he said. "Not in Abilene necessarily, though if Abilene is what you want, I can make a life here. I am good with horses and I learn things quickly and I am not afraid of work. But I want to be where you are, Adelaide. I want the conversation to keep going. I want to see your face when you are thinking. I want to hear that laugh you call unfortunate, which is one of the least unfortunate sounds I have ever heard." He stopped and looked at her. "I am not a man who says things lightly or says them twice. I am saying this once clearly, so there is no question of what I mean. I am in love with you, and I would very much like, if you are willing, to marry you." The silence was long enough that he felt the first cold edge of fear, and then she turned to face him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely from the light, and she said, "I have been trying for some weeks to construct a logical argument against the conclusion I keep arriving at." "What conclusion?" he said. "That I am quite thoroughly in love with you," she said, "and that the logical arguments are insufficient." He reached out and took her hand, her dirt-covered, practical, book-holding hand, and held it in both of his, and she looked at their joined hands for a moment and then looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "that is my answer. Yes." He kissed her then, there in the garden with the bean plants and the late afternoon gold light, and it was the kind of kiss that does not ask anything except whether you are certain, and the answer from both of them was fully and entirely yes. Clara's voice came from the kitchen window above them, very carefully not looking out. "Shall I put on extra coffee?" Adelaide pulled back from the kiss, her eyes bright with laughter. "Clara Townsend," she said, "I am being supportive." Clara said to the window she was absolutely not looking out of, "Coffee is supportive." Micah laughed, and Adelaide laughed, that laugh she had called unfortunate, and which was nothing of the kind, bright and entirely real. And he thought that he had come a very long way on the strength of letters, and that every mile of it had been absolutely worth traveling. They told Clara over that coffee and she cried, which surprised Micah, who had not expected tears from someone so frequently in the register of amusement. But they were happy tears, the kind that come from relief as much as joy, and she hugged Adelaide, and then, with endearing boldness, hugged Micah too, and said into his shoulder, "Thank you for actually coming," which told him something about how much she had wanted her sister to be happy and how uncertain she had been of it. They planned to marry in the summer, which gave them time to arrange things properly. Adelaide insisted on proper, not because she was conventional in the restricting sense, but because she believed that the important things in a life deserved the weight of ceremony and witness. She wrote to a minister she trusted. She began making the practical arrangements that women of her period made without fanfare, adjusting the household budget, considering what would need to change and what could stay the same. She was, as in everything, clear-eyed and unromantic about the logistics, which Micah found deeply attractive, because there was nothing in him that responded to impracticality. He, in turn, began writing letters to Ben Polly and Harwick about the cabin, which he could not simply abandon. The cabin represented 8 years of work and was a real structure with real value, and beyond the practical, it represented something to him that he was still in the process of understanding, a version of himself that he did not want to simply discard, but would need to either carry forward or properly put down. Reuben Shaw, hearing of the engagement, showed up the following Monday at the livery with a bottle of whiskey and 2 cups and said, "That's the most sensible thing you've done since you arrived," and poured them both a measure in the morning light, which was perhaps not entirely conventional but felt entirely appropriate. One afternoon in May, a rider came into town on a lathered horse, a young man of about 20 named Tommy Briggs who worked on one of the ranches outside town, with a story about a band of men who had been making trouble along the creek road, stopping travelers, taking what they wanted, and who had apparently made the mistake of stopping a freight wagon carrying goods for the Abilene dry goods merchants, which was the kind of trouble that affected commerce enough to make people act on it. The sheriff, a capable man named Art Garvey, organized a small posse to ride out and address the situation, and asked among the men of the town for volunteers. Micah, who had Reuben's horse available, and the basic competence with firearms that 8 years in the mountains produced in a man who wished to survive them, rode with the posse. Adelaide heard about this afterward, because he had not told her beforehand, and the expression on her face when she found out was a complex instrument of feeling, concern, and irritation, and something that was trying to be composed about the realities of the world they lived in. "You might have mentioned it," she said. "It was over before I could," he said. "It was a morning's work." "Was there trouble?" "The men dispersed when they realized the sheriff had a party," he said. "There was no shooting." Art Garvey is good at making the alternative to compliance seem very unattractive. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Do not make a habit of riding into situations without telling me. I understand the world we live in. I understand that men sometimes need to act. I am not asking you to be someone other than who you are. I am simply asking not to find out after the fact." "That is fair," he said. "I will tell you." "Good," she said, and the expression settled into something calmer, and she said, "Did anyone see what those men looked like?" "Because Tommy Briggs told Mary Holt that one of them was the fellow who tried to rob the mercantile last fall. And if that's true, then Art Garvey ought to know, because that man has a warrant." And this was Adelaide Townsend, he thought, watching her shift from the personal to the practical with the smooth efficiency of someone who processed both without confusion. And she was extraordinary. He rode back to the sheriff's office and passed along what she had told him. And Art Garvey, who was a man who appreciated accurate information provided promptly, made a note of it. June arrived and brought with it heat and thunderstorms, and the particular expansive beauty of the Kansas summer that Adelaide had grown up with, and that Micah was experiencing for the first time. The thunderstorms, he found, were something else entirely on the plains, nothing like the mountain storms he knew, which were contained and vertical. Plains thunderstorms were vast horizontal events that could be seen forming from 50 miles away, and that moved across the sky with a theatrical grandeur that was simultaneously terrifying and magnificent. The first time he stood on the porch with Adelaide and watched one roll in from the southwest, the lightning crossing the whole arc of the sky and the thunder arriving seconds later like artillery, he felt his mountain man's respect for weather expand considerably. "Does this frighten you?" she asked, watching the storm. "No," he said. "It's magnificent." She looked pleased, the way she looked when someone confirmed something she had suspected about them. "Most people from the mountains find it terrifying," she said. "Something about having no high ground." "I think that's the point," he said. "You can see all of it at once. In the mountains you can hear a storm and not see it. Here there's no place to hide from the seeing." She thought about that. "You like things you can see clearly," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment while the storm came closer and the light went yellow-green and strange. Then she said, "So do I." He took her hand and they stood and watched the storm come in, and the first fat drops of rain hit the porch roof and the street, and the smell of it was something extraordinary, wet earth and ozone and release, and he thought that this was a life, this right here, this standing with this woman and watching the sky perform, and that he had almost not come, had almost let practicality and fear of presumption keep him in the mountains. And he was profoundly grateful for the small, brave thing Adelaide Townsend had done in passing along her sister's observation as a curiosity. They were married on the 14th of July, 1874, in the Methodist Church on 2nd Street, in a ceremony that was attended by Adelaide's students and their families, by Reuben Shaw and his wife Josephine, who was a small, fierce woman who had helped build the livery business alongside her husband, and whose opinion of Adelaide was clearly and warmly favorable, by Clara and several of Adelaide's friends from the teaching community, by Art Garvey and his wife, by Mrs. Holt from the boarding house, and by Ben Polly, who had made the journey from Harwick, Colorado, specifically for the occasion, which touched Micah more than he could easily say. Adelaide wore a dress of blue-gray silk that she and Clara had worked on together, simple and well-made with a small cascade of ivory lace at the collar, and she carried a bunch of prairie wildflowers that Clara had gathered that morning, blue and yellow and white. She walked up the aisle without her father to give her arm, because her father was gone, but with Clara beside her, and with the composure of someone who had decided exactly what she wanted and was walking toward it with full intention. When she reached the front of the church and stood beside Micah and looked up at him, there was a moment between them before the minister began to speak, a moment of purely mutual recognition, of two people who had begun as strangers through the careful medium of letters and had become, over the course of months of honest and deliberate knowing, something that the word friends was insufficient for, and the word lovers not yet fully accurate, but that the word married was about to make right. They said their vows in steady voices, both of them, and when the minister pronounced them married and Micah kissed his wife, Clara cried again and made no effort whatsoever to conceal it, and Josephine Shaw said something quietly approving, and Ben Polly, who had watched Micah Turner live 8 years of solitary mountain life, and had privately wondered if the boy would ever find his way back to the world, pressed his hat to his chest, and felt something loosen in the region of his chest that had been held tight for a long time. After the wedding, there was a dinner at the Townsend house, because the house was the sensible venue, and Adelaide was not the type to be married in one place and eat in another if the first place would do for both, and people brought food in the communal way of that time and place, and the table was extended with boards, and the evening went on long and warm and full of voices. Ben Polly got Micah alone on the porch for a moment and said, "You did good, son," and Micah, who did not have anyone left to call him son, felt the full weight of the word and was grateful for it. The decision about where they would live was one they had discussed with the thoroughness that characterized all their discussions, which was to say, comprehensively and without sentimentality about either option. Adelaide's school contract ran through the end of the following year. Clara was in Abilene. The house was theirs. The life Adelaide had built was rooted here, and roots were not nothing, but the cabin. The cabin was Micah's work and Micah's years, and a part of Micah that had not ceased to exist simply because he had gotten on a train. And the mountains were a real and specific beauty that could not be replicated on the plains. What they decided, over the course of many evenings and one very long afternoon walking along the creek, was this: they would stay in Abilene through Adelaide's contract, which gave them a year and a half together in the life she had built, and then they would go together to the mountains for a season so that she could truly know the place that had made him, and they would decide from there where the permanent life would be. It was the kind of decision that only works between two people who trust each other entirely, which they did. The life they built in Abilene was good. Micah continued at the livery and took on additional work when the rail construction crews needed men who understood both horses and the particulars of heavy outdoor work in difficult conditions. He was, as he had always been, reliable and skilled and undemonstrative about both qualities, and he built a reputation in the town as a man worth knowing, which pleased him in a modest way but did not consume him. Adelaide taught. She was, by any measure, an excellent teacher, and her school had the best reading scores in the county, a fact that the district administrator mentioned with the particular tone of a man who finds the data impressive and the source of it mildly inconvenient because it is a woman. Adelaide received this compliment with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by that particular flavor of irony. In the evenings they were together, and the evenings were the best part, reading and talking, and the particular domestic intimacy that marriage allows, two people arranging themselves in the same space with the gradual ease of long practice. He taught her card games he had learned from other trappers in his early years, and she taught him to play the small upright piano that stood in the parlor, badly at first and then with improving proficiency. They argued, occasionally and with spirit, about things that mattered and also about things that did not, because argument between two strongly opinionated people with active minds is not a sign of trouble but a sign of engagement, and they both understood that implicitly. Clara, who was young and spirited and had been emboldened by her sister's happiness into considering her own, began a courtship with a young schoolteacher named James Ellison, who had recently come to Abilene to teach at the boys' school. He was 24, earnest and sweet-natured, and had the good sense to be genuinely interested in everything Clara said, which was the surest way to win a Townsend woman's regard. Adelaide watched this development with the careful attention of an older sister who has been on the responsible side of things for long enough to take that responsibility seriously, and she assessed James Ellison over several dinners with a thoroughness that he found slightly alarming and that Micah privately found very entertaining. "He's a good man," Micah told her after one of these dinners. "He's young," she said. "He's 24. Clara is 22. The arithmetic is fine." "The arithmetic is not what I am assessing," she said. "No, but what you are assessing," he said, "is whether he'll keep up with her. And he will. He's the kind who builds his understanding gradually and keeps it well. He'll keep up." She looked at him with that considering look she used when she was deciding whether someone had said something actually true or merely plausible. Then she said, "You are probably right." "I'm sometimes right," he said. "You are frequently right," she said, with the tone of someone making a factual concession. "I find it mostly gratifying and occasionally inconvenient." He laughed and she laughed, and Clara, who was in the kitchen and had heard every word, laughed too. In the late fall of 1874, Adelaide discovered she was expecting a child. She told Micah on a Tuesday evening when he came in from the livery, setting down his coffee and saying, with her characteristic directness, "I have something to tell you, and I want you to know before I say it that I am entirely well and entirely fine." He looked at her and waited. "We are going to have a child," she said, "in the spring." The feeling that moved through him was not something he had any adequate preparation for, not because he had not thought about it as a possibility, because he was a practical man and he had thought about it, but because the thinking about a thing and the being told the thing are entirely different experiences in the body. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and put his arms around her and held her, and she let him, leaning into him with a completeness that she rarely permitted herself because she was, always, more comfortable giving than receiving. "Good?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Good," he said. "Very good, the best kind of good." She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright again in that way that was not quite tears, and she said, "Clara is going to be impossible about this." "Yes," he agreed. "She will probably try to sew everything herself and sing to my stomach and make predictions about whether it will be a boy or a girl based on entirely unscientific methods." "She will," he said. "Let her." Adelaide considered this. "Yes," she said. "Let her." And something in her face softened in a way it did when she allowed herself something without qualification. Clara was, as predicted, wonderfully impossible about it, and the house on Elm Street through the winter months of 1875 was full of a particular kind of warmth that had to do with anticipation and the small daily business of preparing for something that was going to arrive and change everything. Micah spent the winter building things. He built a cradle, working in the evenings in the small workshop he had arranged in the back corner of the yard, with an oil lamp and the particular focused attention he gave to things built to last. He built it from ash wood, joined without nails, rocking on curved runners that he shaped and smoothed until they moved as evenly as breathing. He brought it inside one evening and set it by the fire, and Adelaide stood looking at it for a long time without speaking, and then she said, "Micah Turner, you made that with your hands," in a voice that was not quite steady. "I did," he said. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever owned," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The second most beautiful thing." She understood what he meant. She came and stood beside him and looked at the cradle and leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did in quiet moments and which undid him completely every single time, and the fire made its soft sounds, and the spring was coming, slow and inevitable, full of everything they were waiting for. Their son was born in April 1875, on a bright morning when the prairie was exactly as green as Adelaide had described it in that first letter that had changed everything. He was born at home with a capable midwife named Mrs. Crane in attendance, and the birth was long and difficult enough that Micah spent 4 hours sitting in the kitchen while Clara sat with him and kept his coffee cup full and did not try to make conversation, which was perhaps the most generous thing she had ever done, And then Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway and said, "You have a son, Mr. Turner." And he stood up so quickly he nearly knocked the table over. They named him Samuel. Samuel Polly Turner, the middle name for Ben Polly, who received a letter about it 2 weeks later and who, when he read it in the dim back room of his store in Harwick, Colorado, sat down and held the letter in both hands for a long time. Samuel was a robust and opinionated infant who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness and Clara's volume, which meant he had all of these qualities in full measure and made himself known without hesitation. Micah held him with the careful, precise hands of a man who was used to handling things that required steadiness, and the look on his face when he held his son was not something Adelaide had any word for except right, exactly right. The expression of someone who has arrived at a thing they did not know they were moving toward and finds it the most correct destination they have ever reached. Adelaide took the summer to recover and to be a mother, which she approached with the same serious and unsentimental care she brought to teaching, clear-eyed about the difficulties, unafraid of the mess, and deeply, genuinely in love with the small person she was getting to know. She went back to teaching in September, with Samuel in the care of a neighbor woman named Frances Hall, who had 3 children of her own, and took on one more with the practiced ease of someone for whom children were simply part of the permanent landscape. Adelaide's contract ended in December 1875. They had discussed the mountains again through the fall, and the discussion this time had a different quality than the first, because they now had a son, and a son changes the calculus of everything. But they had made a commitment to each other, and Adelaide Townsend was not a woman who made commitments she did not intend to keep, and Micah had been honest from the beginning about who he was and where he came from and what the mountains meant to him. They decided to go in the spring of 1876. Clara by then engaged to James Ellison, which Adelaide had approved with genuine warmth and only a little bit of residual older sister supervision, would stay in Abilene. The house would stay in the family, because it was their father's house and they would not sell it. James and Clara would eventually live there after their wedding in April. The night before they left Abilene, there was a farewell dinner that was organized mostly by Clara and attended by Reuben and Josephine Shaw, and Art Garvey and his wife, and several of Adelaide's teaching colleagues, and Frances Hall and her husband, and Mrs. Holt from the boarding house. It was a warm and crowded and slightly noisy occasion, and Samuel, who was nearly a year old and had opinions about everything, sat in Adelaide's lap and watched the proceedings with the solemn and evaluative expression of someone who is gathering data. Reuben Shaw found a moment alone with Micah at the end of the evening when most people were making their farewells, and he said, "You take good care of her, and write when you get there." "I will," Micah said, to both. "She's the kind of woman," Reuben said, "who will be happy anywhere as long as it's honest. You've given her that." "She's given it to me more," Micah said. Reuben clasped his hand firmly and held it for a moment and then released it, and they understood each other completely. Adelaide said goodbye to Clara at the train station, and the 2 sisters held each other with the kind of intensity that belongs to women who have been through things together and know the weight of distance. Clara pressed a letter into Adelaide's hand, to be read on the train, and whispered something against her ear that made Adelaide laugh and pull back and look at her with shining eyes, and Micah did not ask what the letter said or what the whisper contained, because some things between sisters are their own. The train went west. Samuel slept in Adelaide's arms, a warm and efficient weight, and Adelaide read Clara's letter and laughed twice and folded it and put it in her pocket, and Micah watched Colorado come back up ahead of them, the land rising and folding and the mountains appearing first as a suggestion against the western sky, and then growing, filling the horizon, becoming the enormous undeniable fact that mountains always were. He watched Adelaide watch the mountains appear. She had not said much for the last hour of the journey. She had been watching out the window with that quality of full attention she gave to things, absorbing the landscape as it changed. And now the mountains were there, white-capped still in March, the snow line dropping down through the pines, and the light on them was the particular Colorado mountain light that Micah had spent 8 years knowing and never adequately describing. "Oh," Adelaide said softly. It was one syllable, but he knew the register of it from long familiarity. It was the sound of someone encountering something exactly as large and true as they had been told it was, and finding that being told and seeing were entirely different experiences. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him, and her face was doing all the things it did when she felt something fully and was not attempting to manage it, and she said, "You lived up there." 8 years, he said. "Alone," she said. "Until now," he said. She looked at the mountains again and then at Samuel, who had woken up and was regarding the scenery with the pragmatic indifference of someone whose primary concerns were food and warmth and being held, and then she said, "Take us home, Micah." He did. The cabin was as he had left it, which was to say, cold and closed up, and requiring the particular attention of a place that has sat through a winter without human habitation. The fire laid, and needing only a match. The stores he had arranged to have stocked through a letter to Ben Polly needing only to be unpacked. It was a good cabin, solid and well built. The logs he had cut and fitted with the same care he put into everything, with 2 rooms and a sleeping loft and a porch that faced east to catch the morning light. Adelaide walked through it with Samuel on her hip and looked at everything with the same complete attention she always gave things, and she said nothing for a while, just looked. And then she went to the window above the kitchen table, the one that faced west and up the mountain, and she stood at it and looked out, and after a moment she said, "This is where you wrote to me." "This table," he said. "That window." She put her hand flat on the table and looked at the window and the mountain beyond it, and something moved through her expression that he could not quite read, but that felt like the closing of a long loop, the meeting of a beginning and an end, the table and the letter and the woman who had written back. "Micah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad I wrote to you." "Not as glad as I am," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the light from the window was behind her, and the cabin was cold but not for much longer, and Samuel made a small determined sound that indicated he had been held long enough and wished to be set down to explore, and life in all its ordinary and extraordinary multiplicity was going on all around them. Spring came up the mountain in slow stages. The snow retreated, and the wildflowers followed it, filling the meadows below the timberline in waves of color that moved up the slope as the weeks passed. Adelaide walked with Micah through the aspen groves when the new leaves came out, and the light through them was indeed, exactly as he had described it years ago in his letter, the color of hammered gold, and she stopped in the middle of the grove and turned slowly around with her face upturned to it and said, "Yes, I see it. I see why you stayed." He watched her understand the mountains and found it one of the most moving things he had witnessed. Not because she praised them or performed a response to them, but because she engaged with them seriously, the way she engaged with everything serious, and came to her own conclusions, and her conclusions were genuine. She had brought her books and her writing desk, and in the evenings while Samuel slept in the ashwood cradle and the fire made its sounds, and the mountain dark pressed close around the cabin, she read and wrote letters to Clara and Micah Reed, and sometimes they read to each other, which was something they had begun doing in Abilene, and which had become one of the private rituals of their life together, unremarkable to anyone outside it, and entirely irreplaceable to both of them. There was a morning in late May when Micah was coming back from checking his traps, which he had returned to in a modest way, enough to contribute to their income without the solitary consuming scale of his bachelor life, and he came up through the lower meadow in the early light, and saw Adelaide on the cabin porch with Samuel toddling very determinedly in the yard. And she was watching the child with her arms folded, and her face in that particular expression of concentrated love that mothers develop, and that is like nothing else in the human catalogue of expressions. He stopped at the edge of the trees and watched them for a moment before they saw him. And he thought about a letter on a piece of cream paper from a woman in Kansas who had said that his advertisement was the only one that had not tried to sell her on the idea of herself as a commodity. And he thought about the morning he had put his furs on the trader's table and taken $37.60 and crossed the street to the railroad office. And he thought that there was a version of himself who had not done that, who had taken the money and replenished his winter stores and gone back up the mountain to the clean, sufficient, permanent solitude of the life he had built. He was very grateful not to be that man. Adelaide saw him then, and something in her face changed in the immediate way it always did when she saw him, something that she no longer made any effort to conceal because there was nothing in it that needed concealing, and she called across the morning air, "Samuel, look. There is your father." Samuel looked. He was 14 months old and solidly built, and had recently acquired the skill of walking at a rate that suggested running would follow very soon. And he looked at the tall man at the edge of the trees with those gray storm cloud eyes that were his father's entirely, and said something emphatic and probably specific that was nonetheless not yet quite a word, and began making his way across the yard with the slightly listing purposefulness of someone who is still negotiating the contract between intention and gravity. Micah came out of the trees and went to his son and picked him up, and Samuel grabbed his beard with both hands in the way he always did, which was not comfortable, but which was one of the greetings Micah would not have traded for anything. And he went up the porch steps and stood beside Adelaide, and she put her arm around his waist, and he put his free arm around her shoulders. And they stood in the morning light with the mountain above them and the meadow below them and the whole clear, enormous day opening out ahead. "Beautiful morning," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the meadow and the aspens at its edge and the snow that was still on the highest peaks. "About staying," she said. "Not just for the season, I mean staying here." He was careful not to respond immediately because he had learned that Adelaide's carefully made decisions deserved to be received with the same care that went into making them. "What about the teaching?" he said. "There is a school in Harwick," she said. "I looked into it before we left Abilene because I had a feeling. It is a small school with an inadequate teacher and more children than she can properly manage. I wrote to the school board before we left. I had a letter back in March." She tilted her head up and looked at him. "They would very much like to have me." He absorbed this. "You decided before you told me," he said. "I decided it was worth telling you once I was certain," she said. "Which is now." He thought about it. He thought about Harwick, which was a growing town, a railroad town, a real town with a future, near enough to the mountain that the mountains were always present but with enough of the world in it to make a complete life. He thought about Adelaide in a schoolroom in Harwick and about himself with horses and maybe his own small outfitting business, because there were more people coming to the mountains every year and they needed men who knew the terrain. He thought about Samuel growing up between two worlds, knowing both the mountains and the human settlement at their feet. "What about Clara?" he said. "Clara is perfectly established with James," she said firmly. "And Clara would visit constantly regardless of where we lived, which is simply a fact of Clara." "True," he said. "Reuben and Josephine Shaw have a son who drives freight between Denver and Abilene," she said. "He comes through Harwick." "They would visit too." He looked at her. "You have thought all of this through." "I thought all of this through in approximately the same way you thought through buying that train ticket," she said. "Thoroughly and before I said anything." He was quiet for a moment, and Samuel yanked at his beard again, and the morning was enormous and clear, and the mountains were going to be there forever, and his wife was looking up at him with those green eyes that he had first seen at 30 yards across a schoolyard fence, and that had not diminished in interest or in beauty by a single degree in the months of daily proximity. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "Harwick. The school, the mountain, all of it." She looked at him for a moment and then she smiled, that smile that had started in the schoolyard doorway and that he had been watching change and develop and deepen, and that was, in its current form, one of the most fully known and fully loved things in his life. "Good," she said. "I was prepared to argue the point." "I know," he said. "I was saving you the effort." She laughed, that laugh she called unfortunate, there on the mountain in the morning, and it went up into the clear Colorado air without apology, fully itself, exactly right. They moved to Harwick that fall. Ben Polly, who had been watching from a distance with the interested attention of a man who had known Micah through all the years before Adelaide, was quietly delighted. He had a lot he had been thinking about selling at the edge of town, and he sold it to Micah at a price that was generous and told them to build something good on it. Micah built a house. Not alone this time, because Adelaide had strong opinions about the placement of windows and the size of the kitchen and the depth of the porch, all of which opinions were correct, and they argued productively about every decision and reached agreements that were better than either individual starting position would have been, which was how it always was with them. He hired 2 men to help with the heavy construction, one of whom was a carpenter of real skill who had come west from Pennsylvania, and who taught Micah several things about joinery that improved his already considerable competence. They built the house through the fall, and it was finished by the first heavy snow, solid and well-made with large windows on the south side, and a kitchen that faced the mountain and a porch that faced east to catch the morning light, the same orientation as the cabin, because some things were right enough to repeat. Adelaide started at the Harwick School in January of 1877, and within 6 weeks had reorganized the curriculum sufficiently to make the district administrator, another man with the same relationship to female competence as her previous administrator, feel both impressed and slightly defensive about it. She did not find this particularly interesting as an experience, having encountered it before, but she found the work itself very interesting indeed, because the children of Harwick were a varied and vigorous group, children of miners and ranchers and railroad workers and storekeepers, with a wide range of preparation and need, and the challenge of educating them well was exactly the kind of problem she found genuinely engaging. Samuel turned to that April, and with the confidence of someone who has fully negotiated walking and is now negotiating everything else, he developed strong opinions about the world and a vocabulary sufficient to express them, and he had his father's seriousness and his mother's sharpness, which combined into a small person who was simultaneously easy to love and occasionally a great deal of work. Micah established himself as the man to see in Harwick if you needed a horse assessed, trained, or brought back from poor treatment. He also began taking small groups of men into the mountains in the spring and summer, hunters and prospectors who needed someone who knew the terrain, and this became a real business that suited him completely, because he was in the mountains he loved and also coming home at the end of it. Coming home. He thought about those words sometimes, the way a man turns a new tool in his hands to understand its weight and function. He had built his first home out of solitude and necessity, and it had been real and sufficient, and he had not understood what it lacked until Adelaide Townsend of Abilene, Kansas, had answered his advertisement in the Colorado territorial paper with a letter that was honest and funny and entirely unlike anything he had expected. Now he came home to light in the windows and the smell of supper, and a woman who met him at the door not because she was waiting for him, but because she had heard his boots on the porch and chose to open the door, which was a distinction that mattered to both of them. In the summer of 1877, Clara and James Ellison came to visit, which was the first of many visits. Clara arrived on the stage from Denver, and immediately began commenting on everything with the particular delight of someone who had been looking forward to commenting for months, and James arrived beside her with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has been traveling with Clara Townsend for 2 days and finds it an experience of great intensity. He was a gentle and genuinely kind man who had been exactly as good for Clara as Micah had predicted, and they were visibly happy together in the uncomplicated way that suits uncomplicated people. And Adelaide watched her sister with the particular satisfaction of an older sister who wanted nothing so much as this. They stayed 2 weeks. Clara fell completely in love with the mountains, which surprised no one who knew her capacity for passionate enthusiasm. James fished in the creek below town and caught 3 trout and was so proud of it that they ate them for supper the following night, with a ceremony that Adelaide treated with perfect seriousness, because she understood that the fish were beside the point. Samuel adored Clara with a completeness that was mutual and enthusiastic, and Ben Polly, who came for dinner one of the evenings, watched the whole gathering around the table with the expression of a man who is watching something work out the way things should work out, which was not, in his experience, as frequent an occurrence as one might hope, and he was glad for it. On the last evening of Clara's visit, after James and Samuel were both asleep and Ben had gone home, and the dishes were done, the 2 sisters sat on the porch in the dark with the mountains above them, and the town below them and the stars everywhere, and they talked in the quiet way they had talked through their whole lives, without performance or agenda, just the direct and unguarded language of 2 people who knew each other completely. Adelaide told Clara that she was expecting again, which she had confirmed that week and had not told Micah yet because she was still holding it close, and Clara held her sister's hands in both of hers and said, "Oh, Adelaide," in the exact tone that their mother used to use, which was something neither of them could explain but both of them recognized. "Don't tell James yet," Adelaide said. "I want to tell Micah first." "Of course," Clara said, and then, after a pause, "Are you happy?" Adelaide looked up at the stars over the mountains, and the question was genuine and deserved a genuine answer, and she considered it with the seriousness she gave everything, and then she said, "I'm more happy than I knew I was capable of being. And I want you to know that that is not a small statement from me." "I know," Clara said. "That is why I asked." Adelaide told Micah that night, sitting in the kitchen with the oil lamp between them and the mountain invisible in the dark outside the window. He listened, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands the way she was always taking his, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Good." The best kind of good. And it was the same thing he had said the first time, which was not because he lacked imagination, but because some true things do not need improving. Their daughter was born in February of 1878, on a night when the snow was falling so heavily that the midwife arrived half an hour before the baby and declared it a near thing. They named her Abilene, for Adelaide's mother, and she was from the first moment a different person from Samuel in every way, quieter and more watchful, with her mother's hair and her father's gray eyes, and an expression of deep evaluation that she wore from the beginning and that made Clara, on her next visit, say that Adelaide Turner looked like she was taking the measure of the world and finding it provisionally acceptable. Samuel was 3 when Adelaide was born, and he received his sister with the same seriousness he applied to most things, which was to say he looked at her for a long time, and then asked his mother several specific questions about her, and then, having received satisfactory answers, decided she was acceptable and went back to his blocks. The years moved. The town of Harwick grew with the railroad and the mining and the general westward push of people looking for something, and Adelaide's school grew with it, and Micah's business in the mountains grew with the increasing number of sportsmen and adventurers and wealthy Easterners who wanted to see the Rockies under the guidance of someone who actually knew them. He was good at it, both the knowing and the guiding, and he had a reputation that spread by word of mouth in the way that genuine quality always does. They had a 3rd child in 1881, another son named Daniel, who arrived in October with a full head of dark hair and immediately established himself as the loudest of the 3 Turner children, which was saying something, and who grew up with his brother's sturdiness, and his sister's watchfulness and his parents' combined determination, which made him a small and very effective force of nature from the beginning. Samuel went to his mother's school and then, at 14, to a school in Denver that had a good science program. Because he had from early childhood a clear and specific interest in the natural world that was somewhere between his father's intimate knowledge of it and his mother's analytic approach to it. And Adelaide identified the interest early and cultivated it without fanfare, which was her way with everything worth cultivating. Abilene showed, by the time she was 8, the same capacity for language and the same quality of attention that her mother had, and she read everything in the house and then went to Ben Polly's store and read what he had there. And Ben, who was getting old but whose mind was still sharp and whose interest in the world was still genuine, found her company one of the genuine pleasures of his later years. Ben Polly died in 1884, at the age of approximately 82, though he had never been entirely certain of his birth year, and had admitted to a margin of error of several years in either direction. He died in the back room of his store in Harwick on a Sunday morning in October, quietly and in his sleep, which was the death he had told Micah years before he would prefer, and which Micah was very glad he had gotten. He left the store to the young man who had been running it for him for the last several years, and he left Micah a letter, which the lawyer read aloud, and which said, among other things, "You were the best thing that came through my store in 50 years of storekeeping, and that is including the day a fellow traded me a genuine Colt Navy revolver for a pound of tobacco. Take care of that woman. She is exactly what you needed and you are exactly what she needed, and the two of you figured it out, which most people never manage." Adelaide, who was at the reading of the letter, pressed her lips together very firmly for a moment and then looked at Micah, and the thing in her expression was complex and complete, and he understood all of it. They buried Ben Polly on the east side of the Harwick Cemetery, under a pine tree, and Micah stood at the grave with his hat in his hands and thought about all the years of his solitary life, and the morning he had walked across a dusty street with $37.60 in his hand, and he thought that Ben had known something then that Micah had only suspected, and that a life well understood by even one other person was a kind of richness that had nothing to do with money. Reuben Shaw came up from Abilene for the funeral, alone because Josephine was unwell and could not travel, and he and Micah stood together at the graveside in the October cold, with their coats pulled against the wind, and spoke very little but stood together with the steady presence of men who have understood each other across years and distance. After Ben was buried, Adelaide organized a supper at the house for the people who had come for the funeral, because the day was cold and people needed feeding, and she was a woman who responded to grief by doing the necessary things. And the house was warm and full and noisy in the way it tended to be when the Turners had people in it. And Daniel, who was 3, moved among the legs of the adults with the confident curiosity that was his particular signature. And Abilene helped her mother carry dishes with the gravity of a child who understood that she was doing something important. And Samuel sat with Reuben Shaw and listened to the old man talk about Abilene in the early days with an expression of fascinated attention, and Micah stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor and watched all of it and felt the particular fullness of a life that has been genuinely lived. Adelaide found him there, passing from the kitchen with a dish that needed to go to the table, and she stopped when she saw his face and looked at him and said, quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said, "I am exactly all right." She looked at him for a moment more, reading his face with the complete fluency of a woman who had been reading it for 10 years, and then she nodded. "He had a good life," she said, "and you were part of what made it good in the last years. He told me that once." "He told you?" Micah said. "He told me on your first Christmas here," she said. "He said you were the best thing that came through his store in 50 years and that watching you get onto that train had made him feel that the world was still capable of producing men with sense." She paused. "He said it was about time." Micah stood in the doorway for a moment and then he said, "I did not know he said that to you." "There are things people say to the wife that they would not say to the man," Adelaide said, with the matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything true. It was good to hear. He moved out of her way and she went to the table with the dish, and he stood for a moment longer in the doorway, and then he went to help Clara, who had come up from Abilene with James and their 2 children, and who was attempting to manage the serving of pie with 3 children underfoot, and a level of cheerful chaos that was entirely characteristic of any gathering that included Townsend women. The years continued to be good years. Samuel came home from his schooling in Denver and eventually went further east to study at a university, which was something Adelaide had wanted for him and something he had wanted for himself. And his letters home were long and detailed and showed every influence of his mother's education and his father's careful observation of the natural world. He was studying biology because the natural world was what he understood and wanted to understand better, and Adelaide received these letters with a satisfaction that was the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has watched a student become something fully themselves. Abilene, at 16, had already announced her intention to teach, which surprised no one and pleased Adelaide enormously. She had her mother's gifts and her father's steadiness, and she was already, in the way of children who become teachers, doing it informally with anyone who would let her, including Daniel, who accepted her instruction with alternating resistance and genuine interest, and including the children of the neighbors, who sought her out with the instinct that children have for recognizing someone who will take them seriously. Daniel was 8 when Samuel went to university, and he missed his brother with the intensity that small boys miss older brothers they have looked up to. And Micah took him into the mountains that summer as much as the boy's age allowed, teaching him the things he had always known: how to read the ground and the sky, how to move quietly, how to wait. And Daniel absorbed it all with the particular eagerness of a child who has found a language that suits him. And Micah watched his youngest son learn the mountains and felt a continuity that went deeper than words. In 1887, Adelaide turned 39 and Micah turned 44, and they had been married for 13 years, and it was on the evening of Adelaide's birthday, which the family marked with a supper that included Aline's very good cornbread, because she had inherited her mother's strong opinion about the proper preparation of it and had then improved on the execution, that Micah stood up with a glass in his hand and said what he had been composing for some weeks. He was not, as Adelaide had long ago established, a man who spoke for the sake of speaking, but he was, when he had something true to say and the occasion to say it, a man who said it fully. He said, "Adelaide Townsend Turner, 13 years ago, you wrote me a letter that said you were responding to my advertisement not because you lacked other options, but because it was the only one that did not try to sell you on the idea of yourself as a commodity. I have thought about that opening sentence more times than I can count, because it told me exactly who you were before I had any other information, and everything that has come since has been exactly who you are." He paused, looking at her across the table. "I sold $37 worth of beaver pelts and bought a train ticket on the strength of your letters, and it was the finest purchase I ever made." He raised his glass. "Thank you for writing back." The table was quiet for a moment, and then Abilene said, "Papa," in a tone of someone who is very moved and is managing it with dignity, and Daniel said, "What's a commodity?" with sincere intellectual curiosity, and Adelaide, who had been looking at her husband across the table with those green eyes that were the same as they had always been, gave that laugh, the one she had once called unfortunate, bright and entirely real and fully unguarded. "What a foolish question," she said to Micah, and there was a whole world in the way she said it. "What kind of mountain man buys a train ticket on the strength of letters?" "The kind that knows what he is reading," he said. She looked at him, and the look was the complete accumulated weight of 13 years of daily choosing each other, of conversations that went late into the night, and arguments that resolved into something better, and mornings on the porch, with children underfoot, and evenings by the fire, and grief shared and joy shared, and the full, entire, ordinary, extraordinary living of a life together. To Micah Turner, she said, lifting her own glass, who came a very long way to find something he had already located precisely in a letter. They drank. Daniel still wanted to know what a commodity was, and Abilene explained it to him with the patient completeness of someone who had been answering his questions for 8 years and intended to keep doing it. And the supper went on into the warm Colorado evening, and outside the windows the mountains were going dark against a sky that still held the last gold of the day. And the house that Micah had built on the lot that Ben Polly had sold him was full of light and voices, and the accumulated truth of a life that had been built on the small brave thing of writing a letter, and the answering small brave thing of crossing a street. He had traded his furs for a train ticket to see a woman he had only read about, and she had been exactly what the letters promised, and more, and different, and better than he had known to want. She had been the kind of worth it that a man gets one chance at, which was what he had told Ben Polly on the morning of the decision, and he had been exactly right, which was the thing about loving Adelaide Townsend. She made a man want to be right about the things that mattered, and then she helped him get there. Samuel came home from the university in the summer of 1888, taller than his father by an inch, and with spectacles that he had acquired somewhere in the East and which gave him a professorial air that was simultaneously at odds with the solid, outdoor competent person underneath, and entirely consistent with the person his mother had raised. He had, to no one's particular surprise, fallen in love with a young woman from his courses whose name was Ruth, and Ruth came with him on the summer visit, a composed and clear-eyed young woman from Ohio, who was studying the natural sciences at a time when women who studied the natural sciences were doing something genuinely unusual, and who gave Micah, on their 3rd day in Harwick, a detailed and fully accurate assessment of a soil sample she had taken from the lower meadow, which told him everything he needed to know about her. He told Adelaide that evening, "She'll do." Adelaide looked up from her book. "Ruth, yes," Adelaide considered. "She reminds me of someone," she said with a studied neutrality. "She reminds me of someone too," Micah said. They looked at each other. "Samuel has good judgment," Adelaide said finally. "He learned it," Micah said. She put her book down and looked at him, and then she said, "From whom specifically?" "Both of us," he said, "equally, though your contribution was probably more active." She reached across and squeezed his hand once firmly, which was something she did when she was pleased and did not want to make a large occasion of it. And then she picked her book back up, and he watched the fire and thought about Samuel and Ruth, and all the lives that were going to come from the life he and Adelaide had built, which was a thing so large he could not quite contain it in his thinking, but that sat in him like warmth, like the particular warmth of a good fire in a well-made house. Steady and certain and real. Abilene was 17 that year, and she was already everything she was going to be, clear and bright and serious, and full of the kind of laughter that surprises even the person producing it. She and Ruth spent hours in the garden and on the porch in deep conversation that no one else was invited to, and that both Micah and Adelaide recognized as the beginning of a friendship that would last, because they had each seen what that quality of conversation looked like and knew its value. Clara came that summer too, with James and their children, and the house was full past its ordinary capacity, and Adelaide managed it with the organizational precision of a general and the pleasure of someone who genuinely liked having her house full of people, which she did, which had surprised Micah initially, given the particular private quality of her nature, and which he now understood as the distinction between people she wanted and people she did not, and in her own house, surrounded by the people she wanted, she was an entirely different order of hospitable. On the last evening of the summer, when most people had gone to bed and the children were long since asleep, Micah and Adelaide sat on the porch as they had sat on so many porches over so many evenings, and the Colorado night was enormous above them, and the mountains were invisible but present, felt rather than seen, the weight and depth of them in the dark. "Samuel is going to ask Ruth to marry him," Adelaide said. "He told me this morning." Good, Micah said. He wanted my opinion first, she said. I told him my opinion was that a man who waits until he has his mother's opinion before asking a woman to marry him is probably not quite ready. He turned to look at her. Then I told him she was excellent and he should ask her immediately, she said. He did in the garden this afternoon and she said yes, and they were both very happy about it. Good, he said again. He also said, she continued, in the careful voice she used when something mattered very much, that he wanted to bring her here, to Harwick, to live near us. He has an opportunity to study and document the mountain ecology, which is apparently something universities in the East are very interested in funding, and he wants to do it from here. Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Samuel would come home. Samuel would come home, she agreed. He sat with that for a moment, the sound of it, and then he said, Will there be room? We will make room, she said. We always have. He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his in the easy practiced way of long habit, and they sat with the mountains invisible above them and the stars everywhere and the full life they had built spreading out around them in every direction, solid and real and entirely theirs. Adelaide, he said. Yes, she said. I would do it again, he said. Every part of it, the train ticket, the $37, the 2 days in a railroad car with a rumpled shirt. She turned and looked at him in the dark, and he could not see her expression clearly, but he knew it the way he knew the mountains, by feel and by long familiarity. So would I, she said. Every letter, every word, every one. The night went on around them, vast and full of stars, and the mountains held steady in the dark, and the house behind them breathed with the sleeping lives of the people they loved. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The whole entire extraordinary, ordinary everything of a life that had begun with a man who was lonely enough to tell the truth about it in a newspaper advertisement, and a woman who was brave enough to respond to honesty with more honesty, and who had found between them the thing that both of them had been reaching toward without knowing quite what to call it. They called it home. They called it each other. They called it the best decision either of them had ever made. And they were right, and they knew they were right, and they sat together in the Colorado night under the mountains and the stars for a long time before either of them moved, because there was nowhere they needed to be except exactly where they were.